racist security guard sees a black man in an upscale store. The security guard asks the man to leave, but turns out the man is not just anyone. The man is the owner of the store. Mike had been the head of security at this luxury store for nearly a decade. Every day he clocked in, scanned the store, and kept an eye on the flow of customers. It was a routine he knew all too well. Mike wasn't just familiar with the products, they barely interested him. He was familiar with the people. He prided himself on being able to read them, to know who was worth watching and who wasn't. Mike thought he knew who his customers were. They came in wearing designer clothes, flashy watches, carrying bags that probably cost more than his monthly salary. And then there were the others, the ones he assumed didn't belong. It was just before noon when Mike saw him, a black man, probably in his early 30s, walking into the store. Dressed sharp, sure, but something about him made Mike pause. This man didn't seem like the typical customer that frequented the store. Mike wasn't sure why, but he made an instant decision to keep a close watch on him. James was the man's name, but Mike didn't know that yet. He didn't know who James was, and that's where it all began. James walked into the store with purpose, his eyes scanning the luxury items displayed in perfectly lit cases. Watches, leather goods, high-end accessories. He moved with ease, like someone who had been in places like this before. But to Mike, that confidence didn't matter. What Mike saw was a problem waiting to happen. From the moment James stepped through the doors, Mike felt something wasn't right. A gut feeling, he called it. A sixth sense. But this gut feeling wasn't coming from logic or reason. It came from a darker place, a place Mike wasn't even aware of. He stood there, arms crossed, eyes locked on James, watching as he moved from display to display. James picked up an expensive watch, examined it carefully. He took out his phone as if checking something. That was enough for Mike. Mike decided it was time to step in. He approached James, his voice firm but not aggressive. Not yet. "Excuse me, sir," Mike said, keeping his tone even. "What are you doing?" James looked up, slightly confused. He wasn't used to being questioned for simply browsing in a store. "Just looking at some watches," James replied. "Is there a problem?" To Mike, there was a problem. The watches James was looking at weren't just expensive. They were out of reach for most people, or at least most people like James. That was the assumption Mike had made. And that assumption was driving his every word, every action. Mike crossed his arms, his posture stiffening. "We've had some incidents recently," he said, the unspoken accusation hanging in the air. James raised an eyebrow, his voice calm but curious. "Incidents?" he repeated. "What kind of incidents are you talking about?" Mike shifted uncomfortably but didn't back down. "The kind where things go missing. Just making sure we don't have any problems today." James' expression changed. He could see exactly where this conversation was going. He wasn't naive. He knew the undertones, the implications behind Mike's words. James didn't want to escalate things, but he wasn't going to let this slide either. He kept his voice steady, but now there was an edge to it. "So, what are you saying?" James asked. "You think I'm here to steal something?" Mike leaned in slightly, his eyes narrowing. "I'm just saying you don't really seem like the kind of guy who can afford what you're looking at." There it was. The assumption laid bare. Mike didn't care about the details. He didn't ask who James was, what he did, or whether he was actually planning on buying something. Mike had already made up his mind. James let out a quiet chuckle, not from amusement, but disbelief. He knew this kind of treatment all too well. "And what makes you think I can't afford it?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Mike hesitated, but only for a second. "Look, man, I'm not trying to cause a scene. I'm just saying, maybe this isn't the store for you." James nodded slowly, understanding what Mike was really saying. "Ah, I get it. You don't think I belong here." Mike was getting impatient now. He wasn't used to being challenged, and certainly not by someone he thought was beneath him. He stepped closer, his hand moving toward the radio clipped to his belt. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave," Mike said, his voice more forceful now. "Or we're going to have a bigger problem on our hands." James didn't flinch. He wasn't intimidated. Instead, he stood his ground. "A bigger problem?" That sounds like a threat. Mike didn't see it as a threat, at least not from James's side. He was the one in control here, wasn't he? He was the authority. I don't want this to get out of hand, Mike warned, his voice lowering. Just leave now, and we don't have to make this a bigger deal than it is. But James didn't move. He wasn't about to be bullied out of a store just because of Mike's assumptions. He took out his phone, coolly and deliberately, and began to dial. This wasn't the reaction Mike expected. Most people in his experience would have left by now. But James wasn't backing down. "Who are you calling?" Mike asked, his irritation growing. "I'm calling the store manager," James said, his voice calm as ever. Mike's bravado crumbled in an instant. He stammered, trying to find the right words, trying to backtrack. I didn't know, sir. I didn't realize who you were." His voice shook with desperation. James looked at him, his expression unreadable. "That's the problem, isn't it? You didn't bother to find out. You just assumed." Mike's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. What could he say? He had no excuse. James wasn't just angry. He was disappointed. This wasn't the first time he'd experienced something like this, but it was different now. This was his store, his creation, and this was the man he had trusted to help run it. "How many customers have you treated like this?" James asked, his voice soft but cutting. "How many people have you judged before you even spoke to them?" Mike had no answer. He stood there, his confidence shattered, his authority stripped away. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, barely able to meet James's eyes. But James wasn't interested in apologies. This was bigger than a simple sorry. This was about something deeper, about respect, about understanding that every person who walked through those doors deserved it. "Take the rest of the day off," James said finally, his voice firm but calm. "We'll discuss your future with this company later." Mike nodded, his head hanging low, as he walked out of the store. The lesson, though harsh, was clear. He had let his own biases blind him, and now he was paying the price. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a man being mistaken for something he wasn't. It was a story about how we see each other, about the assumptions we make, the judgments we cast, often without even realizing it. Mike had spent years thinking he knew who belonged in that store and who didn't. But that day, he learned the hard way that appearances can be deceiving, that everyone, regardless of race, background, or status, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. And James? He walked out of that store knowing he had taught Mike, and hopefully others like him, a valuable lesson. One that would stick with them for a long time. Because in the end, it's not about who you think someone is. It's about who they actually are. And that's the story of how a racist security guard learned that sometimes the person you look down on is the very person who holds all the power. I hope you guys like this story. Don't forget to subscribe and click on the bell to not miss any stories. The last thing I want to say is stop racism.